Hello, welcome to 8.9 News. I'm ffinlo Costain. A report by Planet Tracker asks whether financial markets are facing peak nitrogen. The report presents an analysis of the shortcomings of the global nitrogen industry while recognising nitrogen's ongoing importance for many farm systems. John Willis is the Director of Research at Planet Tracker. I asked him first to tell me whether Planet Tracker is focused more on environmental aspects or on financial tracking.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a bit of both, actually. So, yes, we're definitely focused on environmental issues in the widest sense, sustainability. We're part of the Tracker Group, and our sister company, who's been around for over more than 10 years now, is called Carbon Tracker, and they focus very much on sort of energy and carbon. And then the same founders of that found us to look at sort of other planetary boundaries, if you like. And the reason the economic ones are a perfectly reasonable question is our main client base is the financial markets. So when we're writing about these environmental issues, such as nitrogen, we try and make it very relevant to our client base, which are the financial markets. In other words, why should I be looking at it? A portfolio manager may say, and we're trying to provide that answer.
Yeah, fantastic. And of course, the report that we're here to talk about is focused on nitrogen. Its sort of headline is that we may be approaching peak nitrogen. So what is peak nitrogen and why is it important?
Yeah, well, thank you very much indeed for referencing our report. You're quite right. We called it sort of fixing nitrogen. So peak nitrogen, we're referring to both the highest level of nitrogen in its use and production. Now, obviously, there will be some link between its use and production, but they can get slightly out of line. And the reason that we're arguing that it's so important, it is one of the planetary boundaries. And that, you may recall, has been recently updated by the Stockholm Resilience Institute. So it's one of the 9 planetary boundaries. And why are they relevant? Well, they're very relevant because they regulate the stability and resilience of Earth's system. So other planetary boundaries that I'm sure your audience have heard of are things like ozone depletion, the acidification of oceans, climate change, but nitrogen falls under the what they call, sometimes a bit unhelpfully to non-scientists, is biogeochemical flows, and nitrogen is one of those.
Fantastic. And what are the key factors that are challenging the global nitrogen market?
That's a good one. I think number one, you probably, from your initial question, you'd expect me to say this, but environmental impact, it's really important. And I think that we often generally divide between land and oceans, and this is a really good example of where it covers both. In other words, you get nitrogen runoff going into inland waterways and oceans. So it doesn't just affect land, though we apply it to land. So it's a word of caution there. So there's environmental impact. There's the productivity of our soils. So this is a strange one in a way, because you have to apply nitrogen. You don't have to, but it's desirable to apply nitrogen fertilizers to increase yield. But if you put too much on it, then actually it starts to have a negative impact on the structure of soil. So you've got to look at it as a band rather than just a sort of number like 420 parts per million of carbon. So that's slightly different. You've also got in there the sort of usual economic arguments about the desire of corporates to maximize profit. So what does agriculture do to maximize profits? It wants to minimize the input costs, such as nitrogen fertilizers, maximize the yield. And what do the fertilizer companies want to do? They want to sell as much of it as possible. So you can see some sort of challenges there. So you're sort of faced with this sort of, I'm going to nick from economics, one of their terms, this sort of Goldilocks range, if you like, not too much, but not too little. And then I would think that the final challenge, if I may say, is having just released this note and speaking to people in financial markets, there's just not a lot of knowledge of this issue because it often hasn't come up. And, you know, it's a neighbor in the periodic table to carbon. Well, we just need to move across one and then we're hitting nitrogen.
We'll come on later to whether synthetic nitrogen in and of itself is something that's needed in order to grow food. But before we get there, the report talks about the inefficiency of synthetic nitrogen application on many farms. How can this be addressed and what difference will it make?
Yeah, good question. By inefficiency, so it's sort of clear to everyone, we're talking about overuse. In other words, I was talking about this band earlier. So what I'm talking about is over applying. So, you know, this belief that as I add more and more of these synthetic fertilizers, that my yield keeps going up and up, and it doesn't actually. It starts to head the other way. So when we talk about efficiency, we mean putting the right amounts on, if you like, to get that balance right. Unfortunately, and again, it's an interesting example and something that when we've been talking to financial markets, they've got is there's a very close relationship in this efficiency also with climate change, which complicates things. So let me just give you one example of that. And you would have read it, if there's excess flooding, torrential downpours, etc., what actually happens, a lot of the synthetic nitrogen gets washed away. So what do I now do? I've got a pollution problem because it's been washed away, but I've also got a yield problem. So I now go and buy some more and apply more to it. You can see it gets complicated very quickly.
Do you have a sense, I think the report said around 30 to 40% of the amount of nitrogen that's actually taken up by plants in a standard farm system? Because that sounds like a phenomenal amount of waste there.
That's absolutely correct. And a lot of that, of course, will go in terms of emissions. And if you look at the emissions from the nitrogen-based fertilizers, they're about 300 times more potent than that of carbon. So it's a relevant issue.
Now, the report says that sub-Saharan Africa should be using more synthetic fertilizer, and more generally that nitrogen fertilizer is needed to produce enough food to feed the world. My question is, at what levels do you have in mind, and how have you come to the conclusion that it's something that's necessary to feed the world?
Yeah, thank you for raising it, because it's the really delicate subject really when we wrote this, and we're very, very conscious of it, because I think it's very easy to sort of take a global north view that, you know, effectively we can fill our shelves and we can feed ourselves, so let's just cut the amount of nitrogen. And perhaps one of the most high profile cases of overuse of nitrogen is in the Netherlands, and by the way, Belgium, that you've even had political parties formed on the back of it. So it's really got into mainstream politics there. But there are many people who struggle to feed themselves, as you'll know from UN and FAO information. So there is quite a lot of data around about the use of nitrogen. A lot of it actually is with academia, which if you look at our report, and sort of apologies in one sense, there is a lot of references, but that's because you've got to go to a lot of places to get this information. And what you find out that generally, word of caution there, fertilizer is underused in Africa. Now, why is that? It can actually be down to factors such as market access, infrastructure, and of course, which we mentioned earlier, fertilizer costs. But if we do a more detailed analysis, we're able to look at crop types. You're able to look at what is the sort of, if you like, the optimum amount of fertilizer to use to crop types. You can look at where those crop types are being grown and look at the amount of fertilizer that is generally purchased in those areas. So when you start to put that together, you can see that sub-Saharan Africa in particular has yields below what you would expect if you were using the ideal amount of nitrogen. So it's a long answer, but you've actually got to use a number of sources to put this together. But it is possible to do that.
You've given me a long answer. I'm going to give you another long question, which is, I wonder to what extent, I mean, you've referenced in the report the Sri Lankan experience where there was, a very rapid withdrawal of nitrogen fertilizers. And nobody's suggesting, I don't think, that that we should just eliminate nitrogen fertilizer overnight. However, there are an increasing number of reports from very reputable think tanks showing that agroecology actually is the only way really to solve the problems of the world in terms of producing enough nutrition at the same time as staying within those planetary boundaries, solving climate crisis in terms of mitigation and adaptation, and regenerating biodiversity. And in that scenario, it's about cycling natural nitrogen, and it's about using more nitrogen fixing crops rather than synthetic nitrogen. And presumably that would have quite a marked impact on the market if it was taken up globally.
That's right, and of course the way that a lot of people will sum it up is they're now talking about regenerative agriculture. We fully understand that, and another piece of research we wrote was actually trying to map out, trying to provide a roadmap for financial institutions. And one of the things that we look at is regenerative agriculture. But one word of caution here, I think it's very easy for us to use that term. And I think there's a lot of work going into what exactly do you mean by regenerative agriculture, but more natural tilling processes, etc., maybe less chemicals. And you referenced it earlier quite rightly. Are there more natural manures that we can use as well? I think there's quite a lot of work to do on that. There is some attraction about that, because if you're starting to use things like natural manures rather than synthetic, is it a hell of a lot cheaper? Well, you would expect so in many cases, and it involves it's available locally, so you can begin to sort of see the attractions. But my word of caution is, when we talk about regenerative agriculture, let's make sure it's sort of defined and we know what we're talking about.
Thinking again about the peak that we started from, peak nitrogen, do you anticipate an accelerated reduction in synthetic nitrogen markets as natural capital markets become more dominant?
I'm going to say we hope so. I'm not confident enough to tell you that definitely will be the case. I think, as I said earlier, when you asked me that good question about challenges, I think one of the issues is that actually the issue of nitrogen is not high up the agenda of financial markets. I'm not doing that to be critical of financial markets. I think they've had a lot of things to worry about, carbon, climate change, biodiversity, and now sort of social issues. And by the way, I'm not saying they shouldn't be worrying about those things. That my hope is based on the fact, and you've given another example quite rightly, that in some major countries, this has been a big issue. It's a political issue. It's become an economic issue. So I think that's really interesting. I think that if you do start to dig a bit deeper, maybe a not good analogy, but if you start to dig a bit deeper, there are certainly, and you've referenced this, academics and soil scientists who actually have quite a lot of information on that. They've sort of been out of the mainstream, perhaps because the financial markets simply aren't looking at it. So that's why we're hopeful. And I think your example of Sri Lanka is good. That's what happens when it goes wrong. So this is not something to dabble in. We need to think this through carefully and get it right. And I'm hoping this note with its case studies will get people thinking about it and stimulate the debate.
That was John Willis from Planet Tracker. More news on our website, 8.9.com. That's all for now. We're back soon. Thanks for watching.